Imagine waking up and discovering that Marvel's most beloved hero, Spider-Man, is no longer the center of attention, but instead embroiled in a controversy involving an unexpected character, Paul. Who is Paul? Why is he at Mary Jane's side instead of Peter Parker? How did this spark a wave of anger, revolts, and even threats among fans? Today, we'll delve into one of the most controversial stories in the Marvel Comics universe, where betrayal, mystery, and creative decisions change the way the public views But be careful. The more you listen, the more bizarre this story will become. It all started quietly. A Marvel narrative arc seemed common, another attempt to create tension in Peter Parker's life. But then Paul appeared, a mysterious man who suddenly began to take up too much space alongside Mary Jane Watson, Peter's eternal crush. At first, he seemed harmless, just a supporting character. But quickly, readers noticed something that didn't make sense. Mary Jane was different. Suddenly, the spark of romance that had always connected Mary Jane and Peter seemed extinguished, replaced by a strange complicity with this Paul character. No one knew his past, his true importance, or even his true role in the plot. But there was something disturbing. The more Paul appeared, the more Peter was silent. And the fans didn't agree. Social media exploded! Marvel fan forums were ablaze. Hashtags calling for Paul's departure began circulating on Twitter. But why so much hatred for a seemingly secondary character? The answer was simple. Fans felt betrayed. For decades, the connection between Peter and Mary Jane had been one of the emotional pillars of the narrative. They had endured tragedies, dangers, losses, and rebirths together. And now, without explanation, without context, without any build-up, Mary Jane was with another man. But that wasn't all. Rumors began to circulate that Paul was just a supporting character. He had been purposefully placed to separate the iconic couple once and for all. And suddenly, a superhero story turned into a soap opera full of mystery and resentment. The most frightening thing was Marvel's own silence. 4 months, the publisher maintained the suspense, without clearly explaining where Paul came from, what his intentions were, or why Mary Jane seemed so distant from Peter. This silence fueled theories. Some believed Paul was hiding a dark secret, perhaps even linked to classic Spider-Man villains. Others said he was just a lazy excuse from writers trying to force cheap drama. But there was an even more disturbing theory. What if Paul was more than just a human? What if he was a specter created precisely to manipulate Mary Jane, driving her away from Peter? Suddenly, the community wasn't just outraged. They were scared. Emotions on edge. It was at this point that the narrative began to take on the contours of a psychological thriller. Every page seemed to hide something. Every look Mary Jane gave, Paul seemed to carry a secret. And every moment Peter was left out only increased the feeling of emptiness among fans. This is where the controversy reached its peak. Readers began to wonder if they truly knew their heroes. After all, if Marvel could simply separate such an important couple without explanation, what else could be changed? The feeling wasn't just anger, but fear. Fear that Spider-Man, one of the most human and beloved characters in comics, was being erased in his own story. And here's where everything changes. Paul's presence didn't seem random. With each issue, subtle signs indicated that something much bigger was happening. A conspiracy, emotional manipulation, or perhaps a dark plan involving characters who hadn't yet shown their faces. All we know is that fan outrage didn't diminish. On the contrary, it grew. Because the more people talked about Paul, the less they talked about the true protagonist. Who is Paul? Anyway, to understand the fans' fury, we need to look directly at the center of the controversy. Paul, when he first appeared, he seemed like just another extra, someone who would be part of a fleeting subplot. But over time, his presence grew, until he became the linchpin of one of the biggest narrative conflicts involving Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson. And the problem wasn't just his appearance. It was how he was placed in the story. There was no build-up, No gradual development. Paul simply appeared and was there, suddenly living alongside Mary Jane, as if this were normal. The most painful detail for readers. In some issues, Paul was portrayed almost as a replacement for Peter, someone who filled the same spaces, but without the essence, without the journey, without the weight of all the struggle Peter had carried for decades. But the question that really plagues is, who is Paul? Marvel, instead of clarifying, chose to play with shadows. His past was revealed in fragments, deliberately confusing. Some details emerged, such as the connection to parallel dimensions and stories involving magic and technology, but nothing solid. And that's precisely where the discomfort increases, because the more the reader tries to understand, the more the story seems to slip away, as if Paul were an enigma created solely to destabilize everything we knew. Some fans even suggested that Paul was a mental manipulation, perhaps the work of villains like Mephisto or the Jackal. Others believed he was a test to measure how far readers would tolerate seeing Peter Parker erased from their own narrative. But there was an even more macabre detail. Mary Jane's expressions. Mary Jane's lost gaze. If you look back at the issues where Paul appears, you'll notice something unsettling. Mary Jane rarely looks happy. Her eyes carry a strange weight, as if there were an unspoken secret, a silent trauma. And this gave rise to a chilling theory. What if Mary Jane was unreally by Paul's side of her own free will? What if she had been forced, manipulated, or even trapped in a narrative beyond her control? This interpretation transformed a simple controversy into something dark, almost psychological horror, because suddenly, fans weren't just seeing the separation of an iconic couple. They were seeing a beloved character being consumed by something invisible, inexplicable. It was like watching someone being kidnapped. But within the pages of a comic book, Marvel's silence. Strategy or indifference? As the anger grew, Marvel remained silent. No clear answers. No statements to calm fans. Just pages that added fuel to the fire. For some, this was a brilliant marketing ploy. Keeping everyone trapped, arguing, fighting, speculating. For others, it was simply indifference. A way of treating classic characters as disposable parts. But what no one can deny is that the suspense worked. With each new release, even angry fans rushed to read it, because there was a latent fear. What if, at some point, Marvel truly erased everything we loved about Peter Parker? As the months passed, the outrage went from being just isolated comments to becoming a movement. Campaigns emerged, calling for Paul to be removed from the story. Some fans created online petitions. Others recorded emotional videos explaining why this narrative was destroying decades of carefully constructed history. And each time Marvel released an issue without answering these questions, the tension only grew. Paul was no longer just a character. He became the symbol of a struggle. The struggle between fans who defend the essence of Spider-Man and writers who, apparently, were willing to sacrifice everything for a controversial twist. And here's the scariest detail. Many fans reported that reading these stories was suffocating. Not because of the writing style itself, but because of the psychological toll. It was like watching an inevitable tragedy. Like watching a hero slowly being erased, page by page. Peter Parker, who had always fought monsters, gods, aliens, and deadly villains, now seemed powerless in the face of something far more devastating. The very narrative surrounding him. It was almost as if Marvel was saying, "You thought Peter would always win. Now watch him lose, not to a villain, but to fate." The suspense builds. And the more desperate fans became, the more questions arose. Who really is Paul? Why does Mary Jane seem strangely distant, as if she's no longer herself? What is the plan behind this narrative? Will Peter Parker lose everything all at once? These questions didn't just irritate, they frightened. Because with every page, it felt like something darker was hidden, ready to be revealed. By this point, Paul was no longer just a character. He had become a shadow, an enigma that gnawed not only at Spider-Man's story, but also at the minds of readers. And when Marvel didn't provide answers, fans began searching for their own explanations. And this is where something even more fascinating and frightening. Theories that sounded more like horror movie plots than comic book hypotheses began spreading like a virus across social media. Theory 1. Mephisto's puppet. One of the strongest theories held that Paul was no ordinary man. He was, in fact, a creation or manipulation of Mephisto, the demon who had altered Peter and Mary Jane's fate before. The logic was simple. If Mephisto had already erased their marriage in the past, why wouldn't he go further now, creating a replacement to take Peter's place in Mary Jane's life? This idea, besides being plausible, was frightening, because it wasn't just any villain interfering. He was evil, personified, distorting realities and destroying lives, all to humiliate Spider-Man. What if Paul was just a mask? An empty shell used to keep Mary Jane trapped in a cycle of pain. This theory sounded like a recurring nightmare, and fans felt its weight with every issue. Theory to the dimensional imposter. Another popular theory was that Paul was an alternate version of Peter Parker hailing from a parallel universe, but not a heroic Peter. Quite the opposite. A broken, corrupted Peter who lost everything and somehow found a way to infiltrate the life of Earthbound Mary Jane. This explanation touched on something even more disturbing. What if Mary Jane was caught in a silent dilemma between the Peter she always loved and a distorted reflection of him, hailing from a dimension where only pain existed? Fans began to analyze every detail of Paul, every expression, every line of dialogue, as if searching for clues that he was a dark mirror of Peter. The idea sounded like a cosmic horror story in which alternate versions of the hero themselves turn into monsters. Theory 3. Mary Jane in prison. But there was an even darker theory on it, perhaps the most distressing of all. Some readers believe that Mary Jane wasn't really living her life with Paul. She was, in fact, trapped in an illusion. Paul was the jailer. Their relationship wasn't love, but psychological captivity. Her every gesture, every blank look, was the reflection of a manipulated mind, a broken soul. This vision transformed the entire controversy into a psychological horror tale. Mary Jane trapped in a distorted reality, silently screaming for help while Peter, on the outside, couldn't hear. It was like watching an invisible kidnapping victim begging for help within the pages of a comic book. These theories weren't just speculation. They reflected the reader's real pain. Because, for many, Mary Jane represented hope. She was the human balance amidst the chaos of Peter Parker's life. Seeing her beside Paul, distant, erased, was like losing a piece of the hero himself. And when fans began to see these narratives as prison, illusion, or demonic manipulation, the feeling of fear mixed with indignation, the comic, which was supposed to be entertainment, became a collective nightmare. And what made everything even more suffocating was, once again, Marvel's silence. They didn't confirm, they didn't deny, they just let the tension build. It was as if the creators themselves were reveling in the fans' emotional pain, fueling each theory as fuel to keep everyone hooked. The suspense grew with each issue. Fear became part of the reading. The unanswered question, ultimately, all these theories revolved around a single question. Who really is Paul? A puppet of Mephisto? A dimensional imposter? An invisible jailer? Or just an ordinary human being put in the wrong place at the wrong time? This question became a maze with no way out. And, like in any good horror film, the more you search, the more lost you become. What began as an annoyance became one of the biggest storms in recent Marvel history. With each issue that pitted Paul and Mary Jane against each other, fans felt like a knife was being driven deeper into their hearts. And the publisher's silence only fueled the outrage. It was as if Marvel were watching from afar, smiling, while an entire community burned in flames. But no one imagined that this fury would spill from the pages and take on a life of its own, transforming into something bigger, darker, almost uncontrollable. Twitter, Reddit, fan forums, Facebook groups. all became battlegrounds. The hashtags #remove Paul and #save Spider-Man exploded, accompanied by montages, memes, and even digital posters with protest messages. But along with the legitimate outrage came something more disturbing. Hateful messages directed at writers, editors, and even artists involved in the story. Some even received threats, demonstrating how the controversy had transcended the boundaries of fiction. It was as if Paul, a fictional character, had become a real enemy, the embodiment of everything fans hated. And Marvel, they remained silent. No official statement, no clear attempt to explain Paul's origins or to calm tempers. On the contrary, in quick interviews, writers smiled almost provocatively, saying only that everything would be explained in due time. This behavior angered many readers even more. It seemed like a psychological game, as if the creators themselves were reveling in the community's pain, and thus was born one of the most frightening interpretations. That Paul was unjust a character within the story. He was a tool, a weapon created to test the fans' patience. While the majority were outraged, a small portion defended the boldness of the plot. These few believed that Paul's presence was necessary, that he was there to create conflict and show that not even heroes can have happy endings. But this defense only increased the tension. Groups of fans began to attack each other. Friendships were broken, and the community, once united in its passion for Spider-Man, was now fragmented into warring factions. It was as if the hero's very spirit had been shattered. It was in this chaos that another chilling theory emerged, that Marvel had a hidden agenda. According to some fans, the publisher was deliberately destroying the relationship between Peter and Mary Jane to reset the hero, eliminating all emotional ties and returning him to square one, lonely and unhappy. For these readers, Paul wasn't just a character, he was a cruel narrative device, created to erase decades of history. This theory, coupled with the publisher's silence, led many to believe they were dealing with something more than just a poor creative choice. It seemed like a calculated, almost sadistic conspiracy. And here's the most suffocating detail. This controversy began to affect fans on a personal level. Many reported that rereading old Peter and Mary Jane stories was no longer the same. Paul's presence tainted even the happiest memories. It was as if a ghost had infiltrated the entire Spider-Man chronology. A specter that transformed cherished memories into painful scars. The impact was so strong that some compared the feeling to actually losing someone. The feeling of grief was real. And then something even more bizarre happened. Instead of calming down, some creators began responding with irony. Phrases like, "Fans, do you know what they want?" Or, "Sometimes you have to shock to innovate further," inflamed the anger. Suddenly, it felt like an all-out war. It wasn't just Peter Parker versus Paul anymore. It was fans versus creators, each side trying to prove they held true power over Spider-Man's fate. And in the midst of it all, the hero seemed increasingly faded. And it's at this point that the story takes on an almost apocalyptic tone. Because with each issue, new details made it clear that Paul wasn't a script accident. There was something behind it. Something planned. And the question that rang in everyone's mind was, did Marvel really intend to erase Peter Parker from Mary Jane's heart forever? If the answer was yes, we would be facing one of the biggest and most disturbing changes ever made in comic book history. And the most impressive thing is that the outcome of this plot still holds secrets. After months of tension, discussions, and theories, it became clear. Paul wasn't just a hated character, he was the symbol of an open wound. With every page, the feeling was that something irreplaceable had been stolen from the fans. Not just Mary Jane, not just the relationship with Peter Parker, but the very heart of Spider-Man. Anger, frustration, and sadness mingled, creating a collective feeling that seemed impossible to control. It was as if a bomb had exploded within the geek community, and no one could escape the shrapnel. For many readers, the controversy surrounding Paul wasn't just about romance. It was about identity. Peter Parker had always been the human hero, the one who fought villains, tragedies, and loss, but who found in Mary Jane an anchor, a beacon of hope. By bringing Paul into the mix, Marvel didn't just upset this balance. It ripped away hope from the character and the fans at the same time. It was like watching a calculated deconstruction. The most human hero being reduced to a spectator in his own story. And it was terrifying. The conspiracy takes shape. When some answers finally began to emerge in the plot, the shock was no less. Paul wasn't just a new boyfriend. He had obscure connections, poorly constructed explanations, details that confused more than they clarified, and the feeling among readers was immediate. It all seemed fabricated. As if there were a behind-the-scenes conspiracy to deconstruct Peter Parker, to erase him little by little. If it was simply a creative error, perhaps it would have been forgotten. But the persistence, the silence, and the vague justifications gave this narrative an almost evil aura. It was as if Marvel itself had become the villain of its greatest creation. And the most disturbing thing is that even when explanations emerged, there was never any real closure. Paul was still there. Mary Jane was still strange. Peter was still alone. It was like being trapped in an endless loop. A narrative nightmare that didn't provide the expected catharsis. And this only increased the anger because fans can't just stand losing. They can endure tragic endings, sacrifices, defeats. What they can't stand is emptiness. And that's what Paul brought. A suffocating void, a wound that won't heal. Today, when we talk about Spider-Man versus Paul, we're not just talking about a comic book, we're talking about a cultural phenomenon, an event that divided the community, that left emotional scars, and that showed how much fans still care about the essence of the characters. Paul has become an urban legend, a ghost that haunts any discussion about He's not remembered for being a deep or complex character, but for being the center of one of the greatest revolts ever seen. And that's precisely what makes this controversy so fascinating. Because ultimately, it showed that Spider-Man is not just a fictional hero. He's a part of millions of people's lives. And when that part was threatened, the reaction was almost visceral. And here's the big question, the one that still echoes in everyone's minds. Will Spider-Man be able to regain what he lost? Will Mary Jane break free from this strange and disturbing cycle? Or is Paul somehow here to stay like a ghost that never disappears? The answer may even emerge in future issues, but the wound has already been opened, and perhaps it will never completely heal. And now, I want to hear from you. Whose side are you on in this controversy? Do you think Paul was just a creative error that got out of hand, or do you believe there was something much larger, almost conspiratorial, behind Marvel's decision? Leave your opinion in the comments, because this discussion only gets richer when we hear different points of view. And if you've made it this far, captivated by this curious, frightening, and intriguing story from beginning to end, I have a special request. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any content like this. Share this video with that friend who loves Spider-Man and needs to know about the controversy. And of course, leave your like to strengthen our work and help this community grow even more. Because at the end of the day, the story of Spider-Man doesn't belong solely to Marvel. It belongs to all of us who grew up believing that with great power comes great responsibility. And perhaps the greatest responsibility now is to keep alive the essence of the hero we love so much. This was Spider-Man vs. Paul. The controversy making fans angry. A story of mystery, outrage, conspiracy, and suspense that still resonates in the hearts of fans. And remember, the debate continues. Until next time,